Hi everyone, Adam here with BishopSheenRosaries, and I've got my good friend Tom Anderson with me today.
Hey, thanks Adam for having me. I'm definitely glad to be here and be able to have a little chat with you.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the state of the young adult community, especially here in St. Louis. That's where Tom and I first met each other. We've been involved in different groups and met a lot of the same people, but also have some different experiences. And one of those different experiences, Tom actually is a former seminarian as well, so he can share a little bit of that experience with us today. But we're going to get into a lot of different topics, but particularly around young adults in the Catholic Church. We're going to look at our situation here in St. Louis, especially because lately we've had this thing called the All Things New campaign, which went into a lot of different, it did survey building and kind of data gathering on the state of the young adults, but also there's a lot of things that we learned as a church about like how to work with different demographic groups. We learned, the strategy moving forward in today's day and age, where we know that there's certain things that are changing in our church, like the situation of how many priests we have, the situation of how our families look, all sorts of stuff like that. And then after we talk about St. Louis, we're going to, look at some of the other areas. Tom's lived in 4 different areas of the United States, so he can tell us about, it's not just local to here in the Midwest. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some practicals of what we as lay people can do now, practicals that we can take home to our parish, to our diocese, and all sorts of things like that.
Well, I think, you mentioned it, with All Things New, I think it's opening up this conversation, right, of, okay, why are young people leaving the faith, or why are they staying, right? And trying to answer those questions I always find really fascinating. One of the things I'm really interested in my own studies is looking at the next generation. So what is Gen Z doing? I'm right at the tail end of millennials, right at the beginning of Gen Z, and just, what is the next generation going to look like? I think there's a pretty broad feeling in the church of, hey, things are changing.
Yeah.
Some things are coming to an end, some things are coming to a big beginning. What comes next? And so I'm always happy to speculate on what comes next.
And not that I think that we deserve more of a voice as young people in the church, but I have had this conversation with other people of like, we're building the future generation of the church. We're the people having children now. And it's very important to listen to that next generation as we're the future. Not that we can't appreciate the past. We also have to, and I think Tom's going to talk about this, we have to understand where we came from. And there's a lot of history that maybe sometimes we don't understand fully, and we're going to unpack a little bit of that today as well.
Yeah, so we got quite a bit to go through today. But yeah, just starting with like, okay, what's going on in St. Louis, right? I think the big thing for the young adult scenes is there are certain parishes which all the young adults know about, and those are where all the young adults go, and they don't go anywhere else, right?
Yeah.
They're very much the hubs. So some of them are the oratories, so both St. Francis de Sales Oratory and the Oratory of Saints Gregory and Augustine. Those 2 oratories are traditional and mass focused. So de Sales is by the Institute of Christ the King, and then
so they're not diocesan per se.
Well, Greg and Gus, Saints Gregory and Augustine, is diocesan.
Okay.
Right? So you have one diocesan and one run by an order. But then there are those, Novus Ordo parishes that have those strong communities. I think of St. Mary Magdalene's in Brentwood. I think of the Cathedral Basilica itself.
I noticed, and we did a little bit of the survey unpacking, and out of the top 5 churches that young adults attend, all those ones that he mentioned, we noticed that there was a lot more availability of the sacraments at those churches. We think that might be one of the reasons that so many people are attracted to that. But also, one of the things that we noticed about Epiphany, a church that we both attended at the same time, was that not only were out of like over 4,000 young adult survey respondents, only about 34 of them said that they lived closest to Epiphany Parish, but over 160, I think 164, said they attend Epiphany regularly. So something strange there about like people are going out of their way for these churches that necessarily, not that they're more traditional per se, but that they really do liturgy well, and they offer the sacraments at either a higher frequency or in a way that people connect with them on it.
And I think that's really where we want to start to unpack, right? Okay, what does it mean to make the sacraments more available, right? I'm pretty sure every parish has the 3:30 to 4 o'clock confession hour on Saturday afternoons, right? So it's like, whenever we talk about, we need more confession times, people always talk about, we've got the Saturday night confessions. But there's so much more, and trying to unpack, okay, what do the young adults need for, trying to balance work-life, family balance, really becomes the next question.
So let's maybe start with this question of the sacraments, right? Availability of the sacraments is something that we noticed is important. And what makes it so pivotal to really center this transformation that we're trying to bring about? Why the sacraments?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So for young adults, we really have two options in front of us. And it's going to sound kind of silly when we say it, but either to stay or to go, right? Mm-hmm. Do we stay with the church or do we leave? And the question has to become, so why should we stay? And what are the reasons to leave? What are the reasons to leave? It's a lot more fun sometimes to go out there, right?
Not have all that extra things to worry about, and
holy days of obligations, going to Sunday Mass,
eating meat every Friday.
Yeah, exactly, right? So it's always going to be easier to leave. Okay, so what are the reasons to stay? So one of the obvious reasons, at least to us, is like, okay, we know God loves us. Now, that's not a reason to stay. Mm-hmm. If it's just, God will always love you, right? If we so emphasize the idea, God will always love you, will God always love me if I leave? Well, yes. Does that mean you should leave, right? Like, obviously not. So it becomes a question of okay, so what are not just what do we gain, but why are they staying, particularly for the sacraments? And it's because the sacraments have the only thing that is unique to themselves, meaning you can't find anything like it elsewhere. Right? I think there's always going to be some attempt to try to mimic the sacraments. There's always going to be some attempts to try to be a false imitation of them. But it's never going to really fulfill us. And I really think especially about the sacrament of reconciliation, right? Confession. It's not a coincidence that when you want to show a Catholic character in movies, you show them in the confessional.
Always. I see that all the time.
Right? You don't see them, quite frankly, you don't see them at Mass.
Yeah.
You see them with the rosary, which is a very powerful icon.
They're at rock bottom in the scene.
Yeah. It's the confessional. So what is the power of the confessional?
Yeah.
Right? And so what the sacraments give us is that opportunity to be in relationship with God in a physical way.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just, prayer is a beautiful and wonderful thing. And we want that to become manifested in a physical way. Yeah. And God wants that from us. That's why he gave it to us. That's why he gave us bodies, right? And so when we look at what's unique about the church, part of that uniqueness is going to be that there is a physical element, there is a real element which you can't find elsewhere.
Right.
And so when you then look at, okay, so if what's unique about the church is the sacraments, is the physical element, the next question then becomes, okay, so young people are drawn to that real element. And that leads us right to, okay, if they're drawn to the real element, they then need to, how should I put it? They want to live that most abundantly, right? They don't want this to be a half measure, right?
We talked about that. I know just, you and I just with friends that our generation tends to do things like 100%.
See,
whatever we decide is done to the fullest.
And that's the thing. I don't think it's just our generation. I think that's a characteristic of youth, right? When you look at the 1960s and the hippies, right? Like, the hippies are not a half measure, right? They went all the way, right? Young people tend to be very rash, and they're very all or nothing. Mm-hmm. And so if we are...
And it usually mellows out right around when they start having kids.
Yeah, exactly, right? Right, because you get comfortable in life and things like that. And so that's part of, what the youth bring to the church is that all or nothing mentality. Now, that needs to be balanced, right? And that's a big concern right now we should have in the church is, there does need to be a mellowing to some degree. But that's kind of where the intergenerational benefits come from each other, right?
Sure.
What we can bring is that fire, is to bring that excitement. But, we are really hungering, and I see this in our local community especially, for that steadying hand of the above generation. And I think that's...
And the wisdom.
And the wisdom, right? I mean, they've been through it. They know what's going on. And so I think there's a part of it that's, when we look around at the young adult parishes, it's very funny that we have these things, right? And I'm not sure if they're necessarily a good thing because of it. Because, right, it's like, okay, you have all of these young people together and they're all going to be on fire with each other, and that's wonderful and beautiful. They need something to mellow them out. They need, some experience in life to say, okay, this is something to die on the hill for and this is not. And so this kind of brings us to like, okay, when we look at these different young adult parishes, they're all very focused on the sacraments, right? They're focused on having Mass in a beautiful form because, young people are going to go, if we're going for Mass, we're going to go for the most beautiful Mass. We're not trying to play a half measure. If we're going for confession, okay, I want to go into a confessional, and sometimes I don't want to just do number and type and then come out with 3 Hail Marys. Right? I think there are times
I want my soul to be changed for the experience.
And to somewhat be challenged. I think this is kind of looking at, again, in a broader sociological sense. Let's take a look at like some of the weird celebrities that have started to crop up. Not weird because they're bad, but just because it's an odd thing.
Like Shia LaBeouf.
Shia LaBeouf. But like
some of the other ones, like even Jordan Peterson seems to have like this celebrity about him, and he's getting more spiritual the more you watch him and stuff.
Or Joe Rogan, right? Jocko Willink. You have these guys, who are very much driving towards this idea of, okay, you do have obligations, right? You think of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. Okay, this is a really weird thing that young people are hungering for rules.
Ooh, okay.
That's weird, right? It's weird that you have, so many guys listening to Jocko Willink, or even,
talk about rules. He's a ex-military.
Ex-Navy SEAL, law, right? Discipline equals freedom, right? That's his big saying. I'm not saying I agree with everything those guys are saying, but it's something odd about this generation is that they're really hungering for that balance of discipline and freedom.
Okay.
That I think, the church can do, and there are times where it does, right? I think when you look at these more traditional Mass parishes or these, solid Novus Ordo parishes, they're going to come and they're going to say, no, if you're going to come to Mass, you should dress well. You should prepare yourself.
Everything's intentional.
Exactly.
Like there's nothing that we're just like stumbling upon. Even like you could tell the way they prep just the chalice before Mass. Like everything is tidy and neat. All the altar servers are like dressed well. They're not wearing their gym shoes. They like there's a reason and an intention behind every choice if you really are paying attention.
And that's exactly right. And I think that's one of those words that has started to crop up a lot is intentionality, right? How do you become more intentional? And I think, you see it especially around relationships, right? This idea of intentionality. But how do we be intentional with our Lord? Right? How do we be intentional with the church? And I think part of what the young people are doing when they are, leaving their local parishes to go to these young adult parishes is they're trying to say, look, I want to be in a community of intentional people.
Okay.
Right? And so they are intentionally changing their community. Now, whether that's a good thing or not, I think that's a broader question. But I think it's better than languishing.
Sure.
Right? It's better than feeling like you're totally alone. I think there is something laudable in the sense of, okay, you need to find a community and you're going to find it. But I think there is something concerning when it's like, okay, our communities now are everybody who's very much the same and very much focused. You can kind of get into some matches with people of how Catholic are you.
Yeah. And that's something to be cognizant of, because remember, saints are radically different. Right? Mm-hmm. All saints have a radically different story, and it's really sin that all looks the same. Mm-hmm. So we don't want to necessarily just do something just because everyone else is doing it. Mm-hmm. We want to do something because we have thought about it and we know that this is the way that's going to bring the most glory. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that being in the young adult community, we definitely have to be aware of the reason behind the choices we're making, and if they're coming from that good place, right?
Well, and let's name it. I mean, this is the controversial part, but let's do it, right? But okay, we need to start naming of when we're going to Mass, are we focusing so much on how the priest is saying the Mass that we're not praying, right? Is that what we're doing? Are we so focused that they do everything right? Yeah. And if they don't, well, they're out of our book, right? I think
there's no music that's a little off what we would expect to be, the set hymns for that day, that week, that year,
And notice, what that is an extreme, extremeness that comes with youth, right? Mm-hmm. The wisdom of an older age would balance this out and say, that's not going to kill you, okay? And no, that's probably...
It's good for you to hear a song that you don't like every once in a while.
Yeah, exactly, right? And to grow in patience, right? I think that's one of the struggles that's going on in the young adult church. I think this is part of the reason, when we look at, just to name it, Pope Francis's motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, right? And we see him remove the traditional Latin Mass from most parishes, and you have to be only at a traditional Latin Mass church, right?
Yeah.
What that's doing is you're pushing everybody into this one cluster, and then having them all just talking to each other.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that wherever I've been, whenever I've seen that kind of clustering occur, it's not a healthy thing.
Yeah, and I know that during the St. Louis experience with All Things New, one thing that my wife and I had talked about a lot, and friends and I have talked about, is that if you're not careful with taking the things that the youth are embracing, and they're really that are bringing them into fuller life with the church, if you aren't careful custodians of that, you're going to see them move to an oratory or move to somewhere where they can find it, and then there's going to be this kind of smaller echo chamber that doesn't have as much of a going out, right? There's not as wide of a reach, and it's something that I think is lacking in the parish life, just your average parish in your average diocese,
Well, I mean, and so that's kind of whenever I've lived somewhere else, I've seen both this done well and done poorly. So when I was
can you talk about that? I know you've lived in Huntsville, Alabama. You've lived in Washington D.C. You've lived in multiple cities in the Midwest. So tell me, is your experience the same in all those places, or is it slightly different?
Very different. Okay. Very, very different. So Huntsville, Alabama was very different from D.C. in some very clear ways. So Huntsville, it's a very new city in a lot of ways. You have NASA in the 1960s, but really has started to explode in population as of late. So you have in Huntsville, you've got 3 or 4 very well attended Novus Ordo parishes, and then you've got 1 traditional Latin Mass parish. And the traditional Latin Mass parish does not interact with those other parishes, and the other parishes do not interact with them. It is very much an us and them mentality.
Siloed.
Very siloed, right? One of the, which is remarkable because it's a very small city. So it's very weird to be like, oh, I could go to the traditional Latin Mass parish, meet all the Catholics there, and then I go to another Catholic parish in Huntsville.
And they don't know anyone else.
And they don't know anyone else, right? It's very weird. It was a very siloed world. Great people, but I think there could be more done to bring them together, and so it's not so much us versus them mentality.
More integration would be.
And I think the key there, in my opinion, was, or like one of the best places I've seen it done was Arlington. So when I was in Arlington, we had there were a few traditional Latin Mass parishes in DC proper, but when you're in Arlington, it was very much, okay, the 9 o'clock is the Novus Ordo, the 11 o'clock is the traditional Latin Mass, the 1 o'clock is the Novus Ordo. It was very much a part of the community life, and it wasn't so segmented
off. Is that also part of the fact that it's more of a global city with a lot of different cultures and backgrounds melting into the same area? Well,
and you can get into, how Arlington, Virginia as a diocese, came about, from my understanding, was there was one diocese, the Diocese of Richmond, Virginia, which they then needed to create a second one because Arlington was growing so much. And when that happened, there was a lot of the more traditional priests went with Arlington, Virginia.
Okay.
So you have somewhat of a it came from the presbyterate and the clericalism, but you're right, not clericalism, the clerics themselves. But there is something to the fact of like, okay, when you're at DC, you're going to be surrounded by a lot of very educated people, and if you're going to be Catholic, you gotta really be Catholic.
Okay.
Right? You are not a Catholic, or at least what I could see. You are not a Catholic in DC because your parents were Catholics. It was very much like, you are something different. You are something weird here.
Interesting.
And so you need to be ready for that. And so because of that, you had a lot of, in both the Novus Ordo and the traditional Latin Mass, a lot of incredibly well-read, incredibly devout Catholics who were very much interested in intellectual formation. And so you had a lot of what the young adult life was then centered around was prayer, penance, and then pub, right? Okay. Having a little bit of fun, right? But, a lot of focus on, developing the intellectual life and developing those reasons for, okay, why am I staying? Why am I here? Why do I believe what I believe?
Interesting. So it sounds like 3 very different examples so far, because St. Louis, unlike it's DC, which is very much a melting pot city, Huntsville, which is a newer city, not that it hasn't been around for a while, but like the growth has been in the last half of a century. Whereas St. Louis is a very legacy city. Yeah. Very much the families from St. Louis have been here for a long time. A lot of the families know each other. A lot of the high schools is like, that's my group. Like, people ask you, where did you go to high school? Maybe if you've been to St. Louis, you've heard that before. It's like, because that tells like people where you're from, your status, kind of like the families that you run with. So like 3 very different examples of cities that have a different way of getting to the point where they're at now. But can you maybe make a common thread through them of like what the state of, especially young adults or the future of the church is for them?
So St. Louis, right, you're exactly right to point out, okay, the parish structure was very strong in St. Louis, right? Where in DC, you had a lot of strong parishes, but it wasn't so much like you belonged to a parish. It was just like, oh yeah, that's a good, solid parish. And Huntsville was very much, you belong to a parish, but it was a parish because it was either traditional Latin Mass or not.
Okay.
St. Louis is very much, it's a parish because it's the geographical boundary. It's what we expected a parish to be, right?
Yeah.
And so, coming into All Things New, I think everyone realized that model isn't going to stay around.
Okay.
Right? And so what St. Louis has as a choice in front of it is, what direction do we go? I'm pleased that our bishop has, kept alive some of these young adult parishes and has given them whatever support that he can. But it is, odd to me that we still have this kind of divide. And I think we want to try to avoid that, because where I saw it in Huntsville, what ends up happening is you see a divide and then you see everything collapse.
Okay.
You don't see those, that healthy intermix.
Cohesion.
Yeah. Where in Arlington, it was very much like, it doesn't matter what parish you go to. You're a Catholic, you're on my side, right?
Mm.
St. Louis, it is starting to move more towards that direction of division.
Okay.
right? Where, there was division already because you had the parishes, and this is my parish because it's in my neighborhood, right? You now are moving towards, especially for the young adults, oh, I go to this parish because I'm a radical traditionalist or I'm not, right?
Yeah.
And that's a very dangerous path we want to start to avoid.
That was the word in my head too. And okay, so I think that begs the question then, if it is something we're noticing could be dangerous, what are some things that, someone just like you and I in our parish life, some practicals that we can bring back to our families, bring back to our parishioners, and show them hey, we want to work on cohesion. We don't want to work on division, because division is an instrument of the devil.
Yeah, exactly. So I think part of it is going to have to arise from something outside of just the church. So what do I mean by that? What I saw in Arlington was a lot of spontaneous communities that crop up by themselves. So what that means is, okay, you need to start moving towards, okay, let's have Bible studies that it's not like, oh, this is the St. John's Bible study. This is, Adam's Bible study. He invites whoever, and it brings together people of different parishes.
Yeah.
Because of that, you can start to build up spontaneous communities, which can build as a patchwork between all of these parishes and bring them together and not have so much division. I think there is some very solid growth at the oratory of Saints Gregory and Augustine and Incarnate Word. I know that they've had some back and forth between their young adult groups of bringing them together, right? That it's not so much, okay, they're siloed off. Yeah. It's this patchwork mentality. And I think a lot of it has to, in my opinion, we need to stop focusing so much on, okay, what can the priests do for it?
Yeah.
Okay, as laity, what are we doing?
I mean, we're 95% of the church.
Exactly.
So, we need to do probably 95% of the work. But no, so I think that there is something to be said for authentic small groups, authentic, like you said, people that come from different parishes and backgrounds, and I think it should be something that we embrace in terms of if there's a natural friendship here. Don't just because we go to that church and I go to this church, don't try to avoid bringing people together from those backgrounds. Don't assume that people won't be friends with someone or won't appreciate talking to someone if they prefer a different type of liturgy.
And I think just to jump in there, right? There are a lot of young men in the church who are hungering for a leadership role, right? I think that's part of the reason why they love the traditional Latin Mass, is because they feel like they can be a part of it, that they can study this, they can focus on this, and they can learn something, they can do something for the church. And I think that's right and good in some ways. I think it can get unhealthy. But I think, part of what our challenge to the next generation needs to be is, okay, you need to build up these patchwork of communities, right? It can't just be... it's not going to come from the older generation, and I don't think it will come from the institutional church herself. I think it's that intermediate patchwork. When I look at the next generation, one of the big things I'm concerned with, but I think a lot of people are concerned with, is the loneliness epidemic, right? And I think what the church, what a relationship with Jesus Christ does is repairs your relationships with others, right? And it allows you to move out of that loneliness and focus inwards and be able to focus on others. And I think, part of what we expect from our next generation, because they are so eager, because they're so ready to go all in. Well, if they're ready to go all in, we need them to start setting up stuff. We need them to be the ones who are participating in Knights of Columbus or the Fish Fries or what have you. I think that's one of the things that right now there's a lot of hidden jobs done by the boomers, right? The generation above us, above us 1 or 2.
And
that, they're doing a great job, and I'm thankful for them. But they're not always going to be there. They're not always going to be able to be the sacristans.
That's honestly a strength I see in the older generations of our church, is how willing they are to volunteer, how active they tend to be in the parish life, and it's something that I think a lot of times maybe younger people have less time on their hands. Maybe they have slightly more obligations outside of the parish. But that being said, I think, like you're saying, we're not always going to have the older generations. We need to use them as mentors.
Mm-hmm.
We need to take their willingness to step up and their committees and volunteering and all that stuff, and learn from them. And this is the successes, this is the things that didn't work, and build that perfect, or as close to perfect, parish balance that we can strike.
Well, and that's something, I kind of want to push back on this idea of like, oh, the younger generation doesn't have enough time, or something like that. I think it comes naturally to the older generation and the younger generation, because when the older generation thinks, oh, I'm lonely, the next solution is oh, I should go spend time with somebody.
Yes.
Right?
We go to our phones.
Exactly. Right? And like, that's kind of a joke, and it's like, they're really addicted to their phones. But it is true. It's like, praise God, I've been able for Lent to start, I am no longer watching, YouTube videos and everything like that.
So you won't even be able to watch
I won't watch this. I'll watch it on Sundays. Right? But like, I won't be able, I really am trying to cut back on screen time.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is, okay, I'm spending so much time. Sometimes they're good things, this would be a good thing, right? But, there's so much time where I'm just watching, some random stuff that, does this really matter to me? Does this matter to my life?
No, it's just attention-grabbing stimulus is what it is.
And it is difficult for us because, when we come home from work at 5 o'clock and have dinner at 6, we really don't want to go do something else.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes it's hard for us to say like, no, I'm not going to stay inside and watch Netflix, right?
And that gets a lot harder once you have kids.
Yeah. But I think there is something also of, we've lost the ability of just like inviting people over for lunch or dinner.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think we've gotten very used to like, it's this concept, right, of the atomic family, right?
Sure.
We're going to focus on just the atomic family, and that's kind of something that we've inherited from the boomers, is, hey, we need to look at a larger community than just the atomic family. Mm-hmm. And this, this idea of we're going to need to spend more time focusing on community, this sounds very like, oh, great, Tom just wants to go have pizza parties and that's what's going to fix the faith. Yeah. And that's not what I'm saying, right?
It's not a kumbaya fix.
It's not a kumbaya fix, right? And, I'm sure there are going to be some people who are going to hear this and are going to be like, oh, boo-hoo, you have to go talk to people. Like, oh, boo-hoo, right?
Oh, introvert problem.
Right? But I do think it is interesting, right, that we have that language of introverted.
Yeah.
That we have the language of social anxiety. Mm-hmm. Right? I think that is something of our time that we need to really start to struggle against. As the church, we are trying to be a community of saints, which means we need one another. Yeah. Right? This concept of a horizontal unity rather than just a vertical, right? The Mass is supposed to be both vertical and horizontal. And a lot of the traditionalists get it very right on the vertical and very wrong on the horizontal. Yeah. I spend a lot of my time with them, so I think we need to talk about the horizontal.
Yeah.
But I think the reason why I spent a lot of time with them is because I was around a lot of people who wanted to only talk about the horizontal and never the vertical, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's that balance. And I think it's that balance that the young generation in the church is really missing is, okay, how do we focus on the horizontal? How do we focus on building a community and making sure one another are built up so that they can become saints?
Sure.
And
I know we talked about the laity now for a little while. 95% we said, I don't know, give or take some percent of the church is the laity. But that other percent, that is the clergy. Yeah. Can we talk about them for a second? I know you were in seminary, and I want to get some of the wisdom that you gleaned from that time. Like, how are men being formed in the seminaries, particularly in regards to combating this new this new dynamic in the world of people that are either fully embracing, they're going, all out to the maximum on the way that they want to liturgically focus and worship and the sacraments, and that's great. We talked about that, and then obviously meeting the other group, the young people who have turned away, who have said, I'd rather do these other things that my faith doesn't matter to me as much. What is happening in the seminaries? Is there disagreements on how to tackle this issue? Are there any practicals that men are being taught?
So first things first is I'm very thankful for my time in the seminary, and the time in the seminary gives me great hope for the church, right? When you look at the seminarians that I was with, really there is a brotherhood in the seminary where I feel like if I ever needed anything, I'd call those guys, right? They're an incredibly solid, holy, community-based focus of the church. Now, what I saw when I was in seminary was you had some seminarians who were kind of going off and either going too traditionalist or what have you, but most of your guys were very solid, very focused on Christ, very focused on celebrating the Mass in the proper and holy way. So I think what's interesting about looking at the next generation of priests is they are all much more interested in the tradition than I think the generations above them. So it was a very common thing for us to talk about of everyone should say the Mass ad orientem, right, facing the east. That was a very common topic, where when I came out of seminary, it was very much why isn't that happening? That's an interesting concept. And a lot of people, even with the Novus Ordo, we were all this makes a lot of sense. So there's some disconnect that's happening from seminary into parish life. I know that when over the last few years, there's been some development in seminary formation for guys to spend a year in parish life. So rather than just having 6 years in the seminary, you have one more year for just living in a parish, which I think is really healthy in some ways, because you then get that sense. When we look at the other factions within the church, there is some pressure from higher up in the church who are confused or slightly wary of where traditionalism could lead. I think they see a lot of the problems that traditionalism can have in it, but they don't see hey, it's this or nothing, right. And for a lot of us, and I'm sure you're the same way, for a lot of us, I don't think we would have been attracted to a church that played 70s music on guitars and tried to make me feel good all the time.
Yeah, I mean, you can already see it. I've seen it in parishes that have younger pastors, and some parishes that have a young pastor and then a young associate. It tends to be that they're pretty quick to make some changes. It happened in my parents' parish, my home parish growing up. They're not afraid to come in and make a change to the music, to make a change to where the tabernacle is located, to make a change to...
Well, and even that's wild to me, right? So one of the beautiful things from my home diocese of Peoria, Bishop Janke, when he came in, said the tabernacle is to be in the center, right? And this in the early 2000s, and that was a very conservative move. I think we've all kind of realized, wow, we have moved a lot closer towards traditionalism as the years have gone by. With the leaderships of John Paul II and Benedict XVI especially. And so I think there is that heartening movement, and that is, I think, the trajectory that the young want to go in. I think my one, concern or, it asked the generation above us is, this is something that is keeping people away, is if it's silly. Yeah. If we perceive it as silly or cheesy or something that doesn't matter, then it doesn't matter and we're going to leave. And I think the next generation of priests really recognize that, and they're like, look, we can't play games here. This is not the time. The Mass is not the time for clapping for people for coming to Mass, from out of town or something like that. Yeah. That's not the heart of why we're there at Mass. Yeah. So I love talking about community, but it's like, that liturgical cornerstone has to be solid, and I think that's what the young is really saying. And when I mean liturgically, I don't just mean the Mass, I also mean just sacramentally more generally, right? Confessions. Yeah. All of us have all struggled with sins, right? And we've all struggled, especially as young people, we've probably struggled with some pretty serious stuff even before, getting into our 20s. So because of that, we really need to have that avenue available to handle that kind of stuff. And what is not helpful is when it's appointment only, right? For a lot of young people, I think it's very much like, we want the seal. We want to know that, like, this priest doesn't know me from Adam, right? Yeah. Doesn't know who I am or what it matters. It just matters that I'm there and I'm repentant. And I think that's something that the older generation of priests don't quite appreciate, because they are so used to, like, oh yeah, if you're a priest and you want to go to confession, you have to make an appointment with another priest, probably. You know what I mean? So it's very normal for them. For us, it's very much like, this is very odd. Let's have it available. Yeah. And I think the next generation of priests is also saying that, and also is very much like, a 7 o'clock confession on a Wednesday night. Sounds great.
I love in the middle of the week. That's great. I think, Tom, this is a good point to also, like, bring in a few more of our potential practicals. And you and I, members of the laity, we can't advocate for too much change amongst what's going on in the seminary.
Exactly.
But we can pray for them. We can pray for our priests, and we can also invite them into our homes. Yeah. I think that's a very important thing that we can be doing, kind of like you were saying. Don't underestimate the power of just inviting someone over for lunch or for dinner. If you want to see change in the parish, make a relationship with your priest. Tell them the types of things that you're noticing are really making you want to embrace the church, right? And we started this whole conversation off with, people are either embracing it or leaving it. Yeah. And if we want to see that change, we've got to tell the members of the head of our church. We got to tell our leadership. We got to report to our leadership what we're seeing. This person left because they didn't like this. This person is coming back to Mass because at your church you are doing this. Give them that feedback. Give them the real nuggets. And I think that's just an easy, practical thing, especially if you already do have that relationship. Foster it. Invite them into your lives. Invite your priests into your lives. Your children, should know a priest. Yeah. And priests love to, get to know what the family situation's like as well. So.
I mean, growing up, I had a good priest friend who was my father's spiritual director, my mom's spiritual director, gave me communion, married my older sister and my twin sister, right? Like, was there for the sacraments for us. And that is one of those, he's one of those priests that I was like, okay, if I ever needed anything, I could call him. And I'm very blessed for that. But I think that's one of those, key points for the next generation for, like, what can you do? You need to start building community. You need to start building relationships. It's hard. It's going to be painful. It's going to be awkward. Yeah. But really, after years, it's going to be fruitful. I always think of one of the first time we hung out. We went and got some fried chicken, and we were chatting. And it's one of those things that I met you and your wife through a mutual friend through seminary, right? And it was always one of those. When I first was driving, I was like, I don't want to go. Yeah. Right. I really don't want to go do this because it's like, oh, I gotta awkwardly be like, oh yes,
we gotta wave at each other in the restaurant. I
think that's it. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Sweet. Yeah. Where are you from? And there's always going to be that awkwardness. But lean into it. Right. Yeah. You're always going to have that. And I think sometimes people think, oh, everything has to come naturally.
No,
right?
Definitely not.
And I think that's one of the things that we need to say to this next generation.
What is possibly natural about 12 fishermen going to random parts of the Middle East and Europe and Africa and telling people about this guy who died for their sins?
No, exactly.
It
right.
was completely unnatural.
One might call it supernatural. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Right. But it's those kinds of things where it's like, okay, what seemed natural to the generation above us is not natural to us anymore.
Yeah. And I mean, now one reason we use social media is because that's where some people are, you know?
Yeah.
And to meet people where they're at,
Mm-hmm.
we use, the platform that maybe they're on.
Yeah. I mean, I know, as much as I, criticize my social media use, I know I've definitely gained some encouragement from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I look at some of these figures in society today, like Jordan Peterson, and there is things to learn, right? There are good things here. It's not all bad.
Yeah.
But, really, you need to have roots in the real world,
Sure.
right? I think a lot of times we feel like, oh, I have a mentor. I'm listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not a mentor.
You need a face-to-face
Flesh and blood. You need,
someone you can,
have a drink with.
Glasses
Yeah,
with.
that's exactly right. And I think that's kind of one of those lost arts that, especially through COVID and through the increased use of technology, we don't realize how lacking it is in our lives.
Sure. Do you have any parting words, any more practical tips, anything you want to rehash that we talked about? I know we talked a lot about, if you find someone from another community that you're naturally, building a relationship with, help it to thrive, to build those bonds, that cohesion. That's one thing. We talked about, inviting priests into your home, inviting other people into your home for a meal, Anything else on your mind about just like practicals?
Just practically, I always go back to Opus Dei, and I think a lot about like, okay, how do we bring God into our very daily lives, right? And that's kind of why I say like, okay, bring meals together, and to bring people together. A lot of the times, what we need to do is not so much add something. It's just slightly tweak what we're already doing and bring Christ into it. Whether it's I'm going to fast today by taking a cold shower rather than a hot shower, right? Or I'm going to...
And you can offer that for the church.
Exactly.
Or for your parish.
Exactly. For your priests who need it.
Yeah.
Or bringing people together over a dinner. You're always going to be having a meal. You can always use that as a community reason, right? But there's always, rather than trying to add new things or do something different, I think there's a lot more focused on how do we just slightly tweak what we're doing today to make us one step closer to being a saint.
Sure. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But if you do want to add something, add a rosary into your day.
That's true.
Bishop Sheen Rosaries. If you haven't got a rosary, go to SheenRosaries.com and you can get a rosary for yourself or for a friend, for a priest. We've got lots of rosaries for you. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. Thank you to Tom. I'm so glad that you could come into my home and talk about such a pertinent topic with us. I think I learned a lot. I hope you guys learned a lot too. And thank you, Tom.
God bless y'all.
Take care.